Hi, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 829th New Social Environment. I'm Chloe Stagman, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the unique pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Ebony G. Patterson and Amanda Gluibizzi. We're thrilled to welcome poet Mimi Tempestt here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we're on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we are speaking from. And now to introduce today's guest and host. Ebony G. Patterson's multi-layered practice in painting, sculpture, installation, performance, and video uses beauty as a tool to address global social and political injustices. Her immersive gardens grow out of a complex entanglement of race, gender, class, and violence. Patterson received her BFA in painting from Edna Manley College of Visual and Performing Arts in Jamaica, and an MFA in printmaking and drawing from the Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Arts at Washington University in St. Louis. Patterson has taught at several institutions, and her work is in numerous collections. She's the co-artistic director, along with curator Miranda Lash of Prospect.6 New Orleans. And our host today, former associate professor at Ohio State University, Amanda Gluibizzi, is the founding co-director of the New Foundation for Art History and ArtSeen editor for the Brooklyn Rail. She specializes in mid and late 20th century art, design, and urbanism in the United States, Europe, and Latin America. Amanda is also the author of Art and Design in 1960s New York. And with that, I'll pass it over to Amanda.
Great. Thank you so much, Chloe, and thank you everyone for being here. And thank you, Ebony and Mimi, so much for participating in our conversation today. I want to start out by just saying, if you haven't been able to go and see Ebony's show at the New York Botanical Garden and you are in the New York area, I would so strongly recommend it. I think that the word I could best use to describe it is stupefying. When I first saw it, I was just like basically bowled over and just had no words. But then the way that stupefaction works is that, of course, the words came to me constantly afterwards, and I've been thinking about it ever since I saw it. So go to see it. If you're a New York resident, you can go for free on Wednesdays. And if you're a New York resident who lives in the Bronx, you can go for free all the time. So make sure that you go and see this show. It's so worth taking a look at. So Ebony, thank you so much for being here today. I want to start first by just pointing out the gigantic undertaking that is this exhibition. You have installations in several areas in this gigantic garden park, basically. And it's something that if we read earlier interviews with Ebony, she actually talks about that you are interested in starting to work with live plants and really wanting to pursue this avenue of potential in your work. And that you had done a little bit with live plants in the past in an installation at Crystal Bridges, but I assume that this is magnitudes of scale larger than what you were able to do before. So I was hoping you could just get us started by kind of walking through the installations, letting us know what the components are, and then also telling us a little bit about your conceptualization and your process as you were starting to plan this.
Hi, Amanda. Thanks to everyone on the Brooklyn Rail team for accommodating this conversation. And hello to everyone who's joined us here. Thank you all. So yeah, it's this installation. The collaboration with the New York Botanical Gardens has been quite a layered one. It's probably the biggest lesson I've learned as a maker so far. So the work, as Amanda mentioned, I did plant this like test site some years ago at Crystal Bridges in their North Forest. I planted plants that ordinarily just would not live in that kind of soil. But I was really curious about this idea of a garden that was like meant to die, and thinking about it as a metaphor for post-colonial space. And that also came out of a project I'd done some years before at the Museum of Art and Design, when I had gone in, had done an installation inside of their Tiffany galleries, where they tend to show their jewelry collection. And at the time, I was really focused on using plants that had poisonous properties, many of which I came to realize is like there are lots of plants that we would all know domestically, quite a bit of the ones that I was able to access in terms of fake flora, because these were all fake plants. Quite a few of them were Tropicalia, more tropical plants, so they were hydrangeas, torch gingers, birds of paradise, poppies. But what was a little different about the possibility at Crystal Bridges was that I had inserted this consideration around what would it mean to also plant plants that had the potential for healing. So many medicinal plants also to have poisonous properties, right? And so what does it mean to also think about the other side of that balance, that the very thing that could heal you could also kill you, but then also thinking about this idea of a garden, or thinking about thinking about a garden as a kind of social demarcation, and what happens in a garden that is not extended care, it is not extended consideration, because of what it contains, and by extension how it's valued. And so in this garden that I planted, all the plants with poisonous properties died quite quickly, and all the plants with healing properties thrived continuously. So the garden was planted, I think it was like in early June, it was given an initial watering for planting, and then it was just kind of left to the elements. And so the work kind of that I did with the New York Botanical Gardens, this project that I made, it's kind of born out of these 2 points of investigation, of thinking about, I've always thought about beauty and the complexities around beauty, but also to how that then also relates to the garden. I think about a garden as an embellishment on a cityscape. So to me, the decisions to like embellish one's body with bling is no different from the decision of thinking about the land as a body, and then thinking about the garden in the same kind of relationship. So the landscape is the body. And in this case, where the gardens was concerned, I was really thinking about the bodies that are not, that we don't essentially see in its history. We don't see in information that lends us an understanding about what or who might have existed here. All of the invisible labor, whether it is labor that is past or present. And then also too, to think about what gardens like this also represent in a much larger conversation around notions of plunder, conquest, exploration, and exploitation. That so many plants that we come to wonder about and to fawn over, that those plants that end up being in so many of these spaces didn't have a choice in coming, in the same way that so many bodies that it would have been transported similarly in ships didn't have choices. But that's a past, that's also thinking about a kind of past language also too. But if we think about, also bodies that may be crossing borders because of, because they're also trying to seek other modes of survival, that they too have a similar conversation in relation to these plants. Mm-hmm. And so it's, I guess these are some of the things that I started thinking about where the work was concerned. So the summer of 2019, when I did this residency at Crystal Bridges, immediately after I came to the gardens, and I think at the time at New York Botanical Gardens, I think it was Burley Marx's show that was up, the Brazilian artist and landscape designer who essentially revolutionized the way we understand gardens, and public gardens in particular. And so then when I went home and I visited the Hope Botanical Gardens, a garden that one of many botanical gardens that exists in Jamaica, but this one is in Kingston. This is a space that I grew up going to as a child, gone to several times as an adult, because I was interested in like all of these, this continued investment in saving this colonial project. And there was also a zoo that is also attached to the gardens, which is a much younger project, comes quite some time later after I think it's like just before independence or just after independence, but it's a much younger project to the botanical gardens anyway. But I would always go because it's a place that I grew up going to as a child. And on this particular trip, because of all of these questions, it was difficult for me now not to see or not to think about this place in the same way. So I started to notice also too, what was absent at the gardens. Like there was no signage about its own history. There was no information there. I had to, I had to go to the national libraries, and even that information was kind of sorted. I had to go through a couple of like newspaper clippings and a couple of journal entries to kind of piece together what the narrative was. And then also finding out that the gardens was at one point a plantation. Was really interesting to unpack. But there were all of these other questions that I had at the time too, which became further much more complicated. So here, this was a British colonial, a part of the British colonial project. And then also too, on the inside of the garden, there was this gift of a Chinese garden that was also there that you had to pay a separate fee to go into. So it's also raising this other question in my mind, thinking also too about the heavy investment of the Chinese within not just in the Caribbean, but generally in also too in this hemisphere, or also too if we think about what's been going on in terms of this kind of infrastructural gifts that's been given globally by the Chinese government, how much this also looks like another kind of colonialism. And this question about what does it mean to see the new colonizer makes its stamp inside the old colonizer. I'm still unpacking that in my head. Anyway, so I saunter onto the zoo, and then there was this, there was a lucine peacock, a white peacock. I'd never seen a white peacock in my life, but it was in an enclosure, it was in an enclosure that wasn't heavily trafficked. And it was quite dark, and its feathers were, spread, but they were falling. They were in molting, and I'd never seen, I don't think I've ever recalled seeing a bird in molting, but also too just thinking about the dramatics of a peacock's tail and then seeing it fall, in this kind of broken state. Just kind of, it remained with me. It almost seemed like the peacock was like haunting its enclosure, and it was just like, it wasn't making any sounds, and it was just like almost like it was floating or hovering in this kind of ghostly way inside the enclosure. Anyway, so it remained with me for a year, and ironically, I had been invited to participate in the Liverpool Biennial and had proposed making a new work. COVID is a blessing, and was a blessing for me in the sense that it gave me time. It gave me time to sit with this idea for a little while. But then also it became also, I guess, because I had to sit with these ideas, then it also gave me more time to work through something. So at first I made a white peacock, immediately referencing this peacock with a tail that went up a wall. thinking about the landscape also too as this kind of rug, that what if we could just pick up its corner and look below, that if all the truth and all of its histories are within the landscape, and also ruminating on Glissant's quote about the landscape being our only monument, that all of the activities and evidence of existence is just entrenched in the soil. What would it mean to be able to pick up the corner of the peacock's tail to really witness all of that? And then I made a black peacock after that. And then when coming to the gardens, I just thought, in walking the conservatory, I felt like this was the peacock's tail. What would it mean for all of us to be able to walk through that? And then also to thinking about the complications about like what beyond the garden just being a point of beauty, and also thinking through the garden as a monument, it's also a grave, right? So there's this whole notion of, like we come from the soil, we return to the soil, what would it mean to uproot, to make, to kind of make bare what has been hidden within the soil, and to think about the garden as flesh.
Wow, now everybody understands why my mind has been blown for the past couple of weeks. I have so many questions for you. So I guess let's start with this image right here. This is clearly not a peacock.
No.
This is a vulture.
Yeah.
And so I want you to tell us a little bit about the vultures, but I think also it's important to point out to people that the vultures in this installation are really, really beautiful. They're not just black, they're black and sparkly. And so what you're seeing here is this bird that isn't just black and shiny because it's glossy, it's black because it's really, really sparkly. So in addition to telling us about the vulture and what you're interested in pursuing with this, I would really love you to talk a little bit for us too about this idea of kind of a push and pull between enticement and revulsion. Because of course, these are birds that when we first would see them would be kind of disgusting to us possibly, but then the way you've made them is so gorgeous then that we want to get closer to them in a way that perhaps we wouldn't want to if they were living vultures.
Yeah. I mean, vultures get a really bad rap, and how I came to them is truly serendipitous. These things seem to happen to me in the middle of the night. I go down somewhere well. And I was at the time, just before coming to vultures, I was using other markers that I saw as kind of like extended conversations around death. So at one point I was using owls as a reference for witnessing, and then thinking about like the owl as a metaphor for like the 3 horsemen of the apocalypse. So I came to vultures because I was like, oh, I wonder if I could find a ready-made, like what other bird could I find that could somehow reference death? And so I just started, Googling in the middle of the night, vulture statues, and came across, a gamut of things. And then I came across this particular form, which is actually labeled a bald eagle. And it's clear it looks nothing like a bald eagle. I don't know.
I'm like,
Nothing. Which is, but I started to like, so in finding the form, then I started looking, like I saw images of also just photographs of vultures, saw birds, other kinds of vultures that I wasn't aware of, the vulture that I commonly know. And I think that most people, when they often think of like a turkey vulture, because our first introduction most likely are through cartoons or and you're right, vultures do get a bad rap, but there's such a wide array of them, and they're incredibly beautiful. But also to the other thing that I started to realize as I was looking at images of vultures, was what they were doing socially, like when they were consuming, it would never be one, it would always be multiple, this was a community activity, the consumption of a body. And in fact, the gathering of vultures to consume a body is called a wake. And so I was thinking about the relationship between the funerary when we think about a wake, and then also to what was happening with the vultures that they just naturally do, right? Which is to consume what is dead on the landscape, that these are both acts of love, the presence of, love and survival. And so at the time I was working on a work that had 3 female presenting figures where you were seeing them from behind. And they also too seemed to be in that garden. And I kept thinking, wow, this seems almost like 3 Marys, and then thinking through that narrative that the 3 Marys in relation to a biblical context, they all come because they come out of love for Christ, but then also too thinking about all the Marys that always pop up on our screens when there is social injustice and people in our communities die. It is women who come to tell us the stories of the bodies that have fallen. So for a while, for a few years, this statement, men die, women cry, kept echoing in my head. And then also too, thinking about the relationship that women's bodies have to the landscape, that, that fundamentally women's bodies are the land. And then I was also thinking about these 2 points of entry, exit and entry into the world. So when we enter the world through a woman's body, and the sound that's made is a wail. And that when you leave this, when you leave the world, the sound is a lament. So the signals that somehow the points of entry and departure is always centered on the feminines, always centered on women. And so just thinking about all of these points of complexities, that women become these voices in these communities, they become the I guess the first point of knowing. And that also too, that these points of knowing come, even though they come as a result of something that is horrible, the action of doing, of doing all of these things is also all grounded in an act of love. So I was thinking about where the viewer sits in relation to the image, that we are witnessing the women, witnessing something that we can't quite see what's in front. But then we're also witnessing the vultures, also waiting to also carry out an act of love. So when I went to the gardens for a second visit, and I think this was during the Kusama show, which I think was last summer, or was it the summer before? All I could think was, what if I could just flood this entire place with vultures? I mean, if the landscape is the body, what would it mean for the vultures to consume here, as an act of revealing, and as an act of care? What would it mean to have a real wake here? And so that's how the vultures kind of, took hold.
Mm-hmm. There is one part of the installation, I guess, Chloe, we could probably go to actually even just like the very first slide, just so that we could give people a sense of what this looks like, where the vultures are actually resting on a bed of flowers and flowering leafing plants that wind up actually kind of taking on the sheen and the color of flesh and blood and decay, in a way that I think that perhaps we don't often affiliate with flowers at a botanical garden. It's a really, really amazing way of conceptualizing the living in order to think about the dead.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking about like this notion of a wound, like what would it mean to just dig wounds all across the compound? I wanted to go much further. but what would it mean to dig wounds? And then I thought, like, what if I could color every waterway red? What would it say about this place? And about also too, like, I thought a lot about the people who tend to come to this place all the time. I thought I observed who the people were who came, who would come. There were often white women who were largely retired women, and I would hear all the stories, about people who would come to fuss about particular plants. They would come because the roses have come in, and they want to know why the roses didn't grow the same way they did last time, which I thought was like nuts, because that's just nature. It's not always going to grow the same way. So I thought a lot about, like I would say, like, I thought about the women who come because of the peonies and would fuss about the peonies and what it would mean to unnerve that person. What it would mean to unnerve the people who would come and just go, oh my God, this just makes me so upset. I don't think I could come back. But then I'm also really, whenever I make an installation, I'm also really interested in the moment after, so what is the physical register that I'm also able to create in a kind of thinking through, what's that called? Like muscle memory. Mm-hmm. So if you come back to the space, it's also really difficult for you to unsee parts of things, almost making it a little bit more difficult for the thing that enters after. So even in the conservatory, the decision to shift the walkway. So that walkway is usually just a clear diagonal towards not diagonal, what is that? A straight line, whatever a straight line is, going straight towards the back. And I wanted to create a diagonal so that even in a diagonal, but it's also like a diagonal that's slightly raised, because when you walk, you're much closer to the trees than you are, when you're just walking on the regular bluestone. But I was really interested in like having this gesture of the body kind of needling back and forth, and then what it would mean when the whole project comes down, the space goes back into its regular iteration of its bluestone. How even walking through that space as a person who's used to coming to seeing all of these exhibitions all the time, how your body even registers that small moment and then triggers back to that moment, to those memories all over again. Is it possible to unsee things after you've seen them?
Yeah. This slide particularly reminds me of this amazing Japanese garden that I remember reading about when I was a child. And the designer of the garden, I don't know, hundreds of years ago, had placed stepping stones across a pond in such a way that as you stepped on each one, you were meant to then see a vista in the garden, which then should have triggered a particular line from a haiku. And so, it's this wonderful way, the muscle memory, as you're talking about, of like, as you step through this garden and you're actually like being introduced to decisions, not just wild nature, but actual like cultivation and things, you're meant then to dredge up particular memories for yourself. And so I think you're right, in fact, that even after this comes down, if you walk through again, you will be then coming back to that memory of your own intervention.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, please go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Ebony.
I guess I was just also gonna say too that the decisions in a lot of the plantings, like when viewers go, particularly on the outside, a lot of the beds have been deepened or raised because they're supposed to reference or in some ways feel like wounds. So there are all these points of recess. And a lot of that, I think, also comes out of thinking through a work that I was making in the studio at the time, which was thinking through the notion of thinking about a wound, a fester. And so what would it mean to work through that physically? What does a fester look like? How do we even, in dealing with the I guess the tangibility of the landscape, is it also possible to kind of smell the possibility of the wound and at what point it might be at? And then also you know, as the plants, the other challenge that the garden also had was because I was interested in leaving things to die or having moments where things would die, which is just not, you know, it's not the nature of, it's not the mandate of the institution. Its mandate is to maintain beauty. But in asking them to allow things to remain, that would die, it also raises a question about like, what is beauty? Because we know that, for example, you know, like some of us will save our dried flowers if we buy them for a really long time, because there is something that is beautiful about that, but there is also value in it. So parts of, as the season goes on, there's some plants that will remain that have died as evidence of their own life lived through the course of the exhibition. And there'll be new things that'll get planted just by nature of, you know, the change in the seasons.
I'm so glad that you mentioned the digging into the earth to uncover this wound, and then also that Chloe pauses on this image, because I was curious to ask you too about the idea of layering in your work. It feels like even if something is completely flat, visually it's never completely flat, right? There is always something else below or above or next to or brushing against. And so I'm curious about that too, if you can tell us a little bit about the idea of depth and layering.
I think, like, so I guess there are two things. I mean, I'm always thinking about like particular words sometimes in the studio when I'm making. But then on top of that, I'm also thinking about how those words are also in some ways guiding what is being made. And so when I started making those paperworks that, and which I think I focused on making paperworks for about a year and a half or two that became quite voluminous. When I went back to working on tapestries, I had a really hard time. And so you're right, you know, there is the illusion of flatness that I was struggling with, even though, yeah, it wasn't flat. And every time, every now and again, I would say to my assistant, Savannah, I'd go like, doesn't this seem really flat to you? She was like, no, it doesn't seem flat at all. What are you talking about? But it was just because I was being, with the paperwork, it allowed another kind of space of play. And I was able to create volume in a way that I hadn't really been able to do singularly with the tapestries. I would always have to layer other volume things. So like, you know, like I'll put something sculptural on a shelf in front of it. I would have to hang a tassel. And so in contrast, I really struggled for a long time with like, it was okay for the tapestries to have their own language and their own sense of being, and that the paperworks could also too. So I feel like this work that we're looking at, which is called Festa, became a way for me to really ham it up, you know? So after making 2 peacocks, I started to just think about the tail, and I just started to pose more questions to myself, because I feel like each work is an attempt at getting at a question. It's not really about answering a question, but trying to, you know, an attempt at digging through a question. And so it's like, well, if the peacock's tail is a landscape, and the landscape is the skin that's hanging everything up, what would happen if you just started pinning the landscape to the wall like a series of skins? And then I also started to think about, you know, like buildings that are abandoned. This, you know, like the landscape also comes for it too eventually. You know, everything always returns to the land. The land always seems to somehow try to find a way to consume or flatten things all over again. Bring everything back into its stomach. And so I started to imagine that somehow Festa, this, which is what the work is called, I started to think about it almost as a kind of like below the architecture, if one were to crack the architecture open, that somehow below all of that, the landscape was already beginning to consume the interior. And that is it was by revealing what was cutting away the surface that we'd see what was happening beneath. But then I started asking myself, well, if this is a crack, then what's on the back? You know, so I started thinking through this notion of if there's a landscape on top, there must be a landscape below. And so below are all of these, what I started to think about as root systems, but as one looks closer, it's clearly all hands. And they're all hands that are red, and varying shades of red. And that comes from like the last peacock that I made, which I'd shown in the Liverpool Biennial. The pickup was all of these hands. So initially it would seem like just the roots, and one would get closer. So dealing with this notion that somehow the landscape is all drenched. It's all drenched in bodies, all kinds of bodies. But then also too, you know, that there must be some other kind of life, that there's also plant life that's also thriving too beneath there. So on the front where there are all the landscape skins, there are these white glass plants. Those plants are bull thistles and dandelions. And then on the back, it was just all of these bird of paradise and bull thistles. And they're both glass plants. And then also too on the front where all the what was, you know, like all the skins, there's also a couple of gilded vertebrae. But they seem to stand on this, I guess, this kind of raw wood, kind of architectural structure. And depending on where you are in the rotunda, when you get to the back of the rotunda and you look up, there are all of these vultures, you know, just looking on or waiting. We're not quite sure what the moment is. But there is, for me, I guess, like layering gives me an opportunity to be incredibly physical. You know, like I often tell people I'm a painter. That's the way I see, that's the way I think of myself. They're often surprised by this, but it's the way it's the way I was like formally trained. And so it's it's a language that I still go to, you know? So whether it's like layering in terms of the flatness of the surface or physically layering, you know, like that for me is what happens here. And then in the work's cross section, there are all of these like beads that happen in the cross section of the work. But then also too, when I make something like this, which was, you know, really complicated for me because I still think so flatly, when it gets to the point of thinking about like structural support, that's when it's truly affirmed that I am a painter. Because I don't, you know, a sculptor would think about all of the formal, you know, the form first and what needs to happen in order for it to support. I'm like, yeah, no, we just make it and then afterwards, you know. But yeah, I really feel like I learned a lot from making this work. And so to be able to make this and then also thinking through what was happening in the garden at the same time was incredibly poignant for me, I think.
I think too, in thinking about layers in your work and the idea that you're a painter first and foremost, I suspect that you are a painter because of the way that you position the viewer as a participant in your work. If we are looking at Fester, we're of course standing in front of it. So we could be standing, of course, in front of a painting hanging on a wall. But then if you think about walking through, you're then in a landscape painting, so you're doing something different. You're both within and seeing your back at the same time. And then if you also think about the vultures overhead, then we are part of that layering. We wind up, in fact, being one of the layers of this gigantic work that you're making without even realizing that we're stepping into it at the same time. And what other art form can do that so subtly except painting?
That's right. I hear some sculptors I hear some other people losing their mind. Yeah, thank you.
When we think too about these glass plants, some of them are, I think, I remember this from reading about it, some of them are basically like ghost plants. They're cast plants of plants that no longer exist. And so I'm really curious about this too. Obviously, I think that we could relate this to the idea of decay and death, obviously. But I'm curious to how you chose them. You know, is it the way they looked? Is it because they were from parts of the world that you're interested in exploring? Where was your decision
It was
there?
a combination of things. So the glass plants that are based on extinct plants, those are in the conservatory along that walkway, that red walkway. And so when I was on site and we were just, you know, like, I think it was one of my, it was the first visit and the second visit. Between the first and the second visit, I was taken around to all of the different departments at the New York Botanical Gardens, just so that I could know what was possible and what areas I could be working with. They took me to, they had a Pfizer sponsored lab. And I had learned about somebody who was like working on working on like resurrecting zombie ants or something like that. And I was just like, what? And then I think that same day I went to the herbarium. I didn't even know what know what that was, but like learning about the fact that a herbarium is just like, it's a library of plants. And all of the so much of what they were had in their collection was like almost 8 million specimen, and quite a bit of it they were still getting to know, because so many of these samples, quite a bit of them apparently are sent to them by like amateur scientists, people are just out in the field, and they're very like simple instructions on how to share plants that that people end up collecting. And over the course of the lockdown period, they were trying to digitize much of the collection. They hadn't even gotten to a quarter of it yet. But it was thinking on this particular, I think it was the first trip, or maybe it was the second one, I can't quite remember. But I had this question. I said, I think it was after I sent a message just asking, how many of the plants that you do know, how many of them are extinct? And then they sent me back, I think they had 20, I think it was 20 or 27 of them. And I just kept thinking about this notion of like what it would mean to sit with a ghost, to learn from a ghost. There was a Vietnamese filmmaker whose name is escaping me now, but there was a clip of a film that I saw of theirs. And in the film, there were 3 relatives who were speaking. 2 relatives who were present, and the other one was deceased. And in this communication, they were sitting at a table, and they were asking, like, I went to temple. Did you like the prayers I made for you? Did you, So this opportunity to find out if this loved one receive these small acts of care that their relatives on the other side were still carrying on for them, I just thought was such an incredibly, a really moving and beautiful gesture. Like I lost my father years ago. I could also relate to this moment also too, where I would always pray or dream that or hope that I would like see my father, in a dream or something. But anyway, so in asking this question, then they sent me back all of these images of, samples. And some of them were, like plants, some of them were vines, some of them were trees, some of them were flowers. And they varied quite a bit. And then given the time that I had to be like really, I guess, really strategic. So one, I thought about the ones that looked really attractive, that I thought could be really poignant, if made at a particular scale. And then I started having a conversation with a couple of women who I've been working with for a while, who've been making glass plants for me. about what would be possible. And that's how the journey started. I just kept thinking about this notion of what it would mean to sit and speak with a ghost. What would it mean to truly learn from the past? But also too, the plants, while, while they're stand-in for plants, they also become a metaphor for everything else that might be past and not present in the landscape beyond just plants. They become a metaphor for all life, all possibilities, and all points of exploitation in that absence, right? And I found that so many of the plants, actually, a lot of them came from islands. A couple came from the western side of the country, but most of the places were, there was one from Jamaica, most of them were from Hawaii, and quite a few from California. So all hot places, and also too, when we think about the global crisis that we're sitting in and all of those conversations and all of the concerns about those who are on the front line, it is the places, they are the places that have to deal with the heat the most. But I also like to think that what the garden in the state that I'm exploring, which is in thinking about it as a point of molting, suggests that there's this possibility, there is still an opportunity for us to think through, all of these actions and to make and carve a real way forward. And we will, because it's the nature of living things to find ways to survive. You put a building down in a plant's way, it still finds a way to, come through the cracks of a sidewalk to let you know we're still under here and we're still pushing through. In the same way that people do, you don't give people resources, you exploit them. You put every possible, stumbling block in their way to kill their survival. We're still here at the end. And that's just a fact, is that we will all find ways to survive. But the question is, are we just repeating the same? Are we still going through the same cycle? And I think that is what's interesting interesting for me as I'm digging, and also to learning also too, is that it's like the more things change, it's like the more it remains the same. It's such an old adage, but it's so true. It's so true. It's so true.
So I think I want to ask you one more question, and then I'll turn it back over to Chloe. We're almost at an hour, which I can hardly believe because this has been such a pleasure. As I was walking through the exhibition too, I was curious about whether there are images of plants or plants themselves that you return to again and again because of the meaning that they have for you. And I was thinking about the ways that ever since we've interacted with plants and domesticated them and started understanding them, we've imbued them with meaning ourselves, sometimes because they look like things, right? Like, oh, this must be good for your heart because the leaves are heart-shaped, or what we think of as heart-shaped. Or if we think about Shakespeare and Hamlet, right? There's rosemary, that's for remembrance, and there's peonies, that's for thought, or pansies, that's for thoughts, right? Plants have always had meanings that we give them. And so I'm curious, are there plants for you that you return to again and again because they have meaning for you, that maybe perhaps we don't understand as viewers, but that you imbue with meaning?
No, I don't, not personally.
Mm-hmm.
There are plants that I think that create certain memories for me, for sure, but it's not that I don't necessarily use them in the work at all.
Those are ghost plants too, then.
Yes, they are. But like whenever I think of I try growing some things myself. Sometimes I'm successful, sometimes I'm not. One of the plants I've tried growing or tried caring for many times are gerbas, because I grew up in the garden that my parents shared when I was young and they were still together, that was one of the plants that was always in the yard. And my mom's tried to plant a few in the garden that I also have at home that I've given to her to do whatever she wants with, but it always reminds me of like the space of love that my parents held. And that feeling for me is warm. I guess in some ways also too, maybe the bird of paradise, that makes me think of home. But there's also, like when we look at a bird of paradise, it's so dramatic, it almost looks a little, dangerous. Because it just has all these points, and then I'm always boggled by its name. Like it's a bird of paradise. I mean, I guess I'm, and then I'm like, when I when I think also too about the notions of what people think about as paradise, it's like paradise for who, I think a bird of paradise does do that because it seems like blades, shards almost, but they're flame like, depending on the variety of the bird of paradise that you're looking at. But it's always a question of paradise for whom. Paradise is often for the people who have the luxury and the pleasure to enjoy, never for the people who actually live there.
Yeah.
Who have to deal with the real thing, the real place, which questions the notion of what is paradise.
Well, Ebony, thank you so much for answering all of my questions. I so appreciate it. And again, I'm just overwhelmed by this installation, and I can't wait to go back again and again. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Amanda. Thanks for your generosity.
Wow, that was incredible. Thank you both so much for that dialogue. We do have a few questions, and I encourage anybody else who would like to ask a question to post it in the chat or raise your hand, and we'll make sure to get to you. The first question I'll ask on behalf of GE in the audience. Ebony, GE would like to know, do you believe looking at art shouldn't just be about seeing, but an active query, one that might prompt us to dig for other references?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, that goes without question, because it's information, right? We could get into like what that means, but I think it will, it's like if you give, not to be so simplistic in it, in this explanation, you give 10 chefs the same recipe, everybody's gonna make a different meal. It's not all gonna taste the same, even though you give everybody the same ingredients. But I do think that it is important that when we come to look at things, whether it's art or just images that we're constantly inundated with by virtue of looking on screens, that we should ask questions about what we're looking at. And maybe not questions, maybe also too, the other thing I would also suggest is, rather than asking the question of, well, what is the message the artist is trying to communicate? I think it would be better to ask oneself, what am I receiving here? Center yourself for that moment.
I love that. Thank you so much, Ebony. And thank you for that question, GE. Eleanor is going to ask the next question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ebony and Amanda. This was so amazing. It's such incredible work. And I was wondering if you could speak to how your practice and your work has impacted your upcoming role at Prospect.6 New Orleans, or maybe vice versa.
Well, I think both Miranda and I, we both bring our mutual practices to the work that we're going to do as curators. I think that the sense of like consideration or themes or things that we're thinking through, or even thinking through New Orleans, the place, which many people like to, will say like, oh, it's the most Northern Caribbean city. in the US, or, oh, you know, like it seems like a whole other country, you know, or, oh, you know, like also like loading all kinds of, if it's not like Mardi Gras porn, it's hurricane porn, you know. What does it mean for us as curators to kind of broaden the way we think of a place? And then also too, what does it also then mean for us to think about how we think about the artists who are coming to help broaden that conversation? And then by extension, you know, also thinking about how that then also ripples back to where the places that these artists may come from, the conversations that may also continue in their own home contexts. So yeah, you know, like it's hard to separate my mode of thinking as a practitioner from my mode of thinking as a curator. I think that's exactly why I was asked to take the journey. But it's certainly been an incredibly fulfilling one.
Thank you so much. That makes so much sense.
Thanks for that question, Eleanor. I'm going to ask the last question, and bear with me because, like Amanda, I have so many things that I would love to ask you, but I feel like similar to Amanda's last question, flowers have such a relationship to adages, and they also have a relationship to time. You know, I used to work as a florist when I first moved to New York, and so much of working with flowers is bearing the fact that they'll die in a matter of days, and sort of living with the prospect of their very, very soon death related to our very, very kind of far away death. And then with gardens, it gets even more complicated in terms of the histories of gardens and the way that they've been these sites for contemplation and slowness, and for kind of, for lack of a better way of saying it, like a lack of control, but also a sense of control, and those two things sort of living hand in hand. And I guess I'm curious, I feel like all of those things weigh into your titles for the works, and in the way that they use these ... dots across them, the way they leave space for more contemplation and more thought to come from both the viewer who's reading it and from yourself, it seems. And I'm curious when you started titling your works that way, and also where you get the ideas for your titles, or how you title a work when you know that you've landed on the right one.
I think that when I started trying to think more narratively was when I started using the ellipses a lot more. And I think that started to happen maybe around 2011, 2012 or so. Because I was really interested in this new, like I think that because so much of the work earlier was heavily centered on loss and death, and also dealing or thinking through its like impossibility, the impossibility of the narrative. I was really thinking deeply about this notion that all I'm presenting is a fragment, and how can I communicate that beyond just making a fragment of a picture, that somehow the title also becomes referential, that this too is a fragment. But it's not necessarily a fragment that's descriptive. You know, it's not, you know, like sometimes people use titles to kind of, a title is a clue. That's what I think. But I also think it's an opportunity to further complicate whatever the person is looking at. So if I mention a flower, that has a particular, you know, it has a particular meaning, and it might mean that the viewer might have to go think about or look at, well, what is the meaning of a hyacinth? What do dandelions mean? That I'm also relating it to another kind of history. In speaking forward, I'm also speaking back, you know, to like the Victorian era, when all little things were imbued with meaning, not just the rose. And so I see titles in that way, and sometimes for me they come from being in. I would like to say that, like, poets have given me a language at a time when I was thinking through this, gave me a language that I didn't think I had access to, or was using but didn't quite understand, because so much of the way that I was talking about the work at the time was still so much related to like older ways of thinking. The work had like long moved past that. I was still speaking about it in a kind of past language. So someone like Olive Senior, who is a poet, who's a Jamaican poet. She was Jamaica's poet laureate. She wrote a suite of poems called Gardening in the Tropics, which is all about violence on the land, of the land, from the land. And there was this one particular poem called Brief Lives that that for years I would just go back to as a point of departure. And I felt like I could always, in many ways, I could take it's not even each stanza, but each line from that poem and somehow relate it to things that I was thinking about. And actually, the first the intervention that I had done in the Museum of Art and Design's Tiffany Galleries was named after taken from a line of Brief Lives. And so I would credit the play of poetry and learning from that from varying poets as a way of giving me additional language to use. But yeah.
Thank you so much for that incredibly generous answer. And thank you again so much for this conversation today. That's a very perfect segue into the next part of our program. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading. And today I'm thrilled to welcome our Poet Laureate of the Day, Mimi Tempestt, to the stage. Mimi Tempestt is a multidisciplinary artist, poet, and daughter of California. She has an MA in literature from Mills College and is currently a doctoral candidate in the Creative Critical PhD in literature at UC Santa Cruz. Their debut collection of poems, The Monumental Misrememberings, was published by Co-Conspirator Press in 2020. She is the 2023 recipient of the SFF Nomadic Press Literary Prize in Poetry. Tempest's second book, The Delicacy of Embracing Spirals, is forthcoming with City Lights in the fall. And with that, I'll pass it over to Mimi.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, and congratulations, Ebony. I was really excited about hearing your relationship or findings about peacocks. I think it's really important to mention that today because today is Oshun's Day, it's Venus's Day. Mm-hmm. Peacocks are very important to my own personal and spiritual practices. I'm going to read the title poem from The Delicacy of Embracing Spirals. The delicacy of embracing spirals duplicates a foreign tendency to graft a landscape. It dizzies itself to become pure pressured, grows through movement as time, the foot following the other makes steps sound like wind howling. All I ever have be the roundabout draining through the concept of a mine. A brain bears logic when magic decides to leave the room. I'm barely in my body. I forget to conjure a here. I hone frequencies out of possibilities masquerading as Sundays. I take up space. I take up moons. I swallow ecstasies. I grin big, forget a face is what trains the world's eyes to fancy allergies. A meteor crash of a serious self like how drunk and high and heartbroken, the streets gonna leave me every weekend. Laugh at the minstrel showcase of a conscious being. Who you gonna be today? The tenacity, fingering fiction of the human condition. Whose face you gonna sing today? Linger to bellow without teeth. Aligned to a cosmic counseling, fly not to think, blend not to blur, the lines of irrefutable irony, the X-ray of a melancholic poet, drug-addled, drunken demon, dreary, drowning, desperate without cause. Who you gonna be today? Greet them at the astral. Tell them it was all a lie. Tell them to form the spiraling. Tell him to dread the spiraling. Tell him to enhance the spiraling. Tell him to force the spiraling, to manifest the spiraling, to embrace the spiraling, to distract the spiraling, to ride the spiraling, to stop the spiraling, to obliviate into madness and laugh at the fickle trickster who knows when to disappear into it all. I forget to laugh during the descent, the insane self, the same question, take it all too seriously. The iridescent subject, the channeler, the menace, the griot, the society, and the society barking back at itself. Briska doesn't talk only to kill the self. I was never here. I am never here. The here is never here. The moment counts down to consent, singularity, and the electrodes of a heart monitor, charred teeth, charred soul, frozen nodes, a fate awaiting the weight of its own feather and heart. Who you gonna be today at the center of infinite? The body proclaimed a Black girl child, each phase of puberty pronounced a testimony of humanity, yet the audience wasn't sold on their performance. Perchance, power be in the voice of the child, the pistol trigger warning. The child wields an entity of fury through gritted teeth, the eye be collapsing. A primordial judgment to step foot on porous ground, philosophical unto extortion, burning passion unto exploitation, violent for preservation. Be the rage, don't perform it. Wear the rage, don't let it get stuck. Break the rage, don't fold it. Surrender the rage, don't personalize. Fiend the rage, don't fantasize. Drift the rage, don't escape. Stir the rage, don't let it build. Feminize the rage, don't father it. Transcend the rage, don't let it become you. Sculpt fallacies only to tell the truth. Be human always, but godless to your enemies. Be an enemy and reveal your palms to none, appeal to none, and let your beauty parade for the masses. All the forces testifying for me to spit on laps. Forget that my gums have been numb for a pair of 8 weeks. I witnessed my foes erode to bloodlust. Every tasteless and variant attempt to harm my spirit will make a star out of me I never needed nor wanted and in the first place. No Machiavellian setup can humble the God behind my tongue. Who you gonna be tomorrow? Reveal too much, say nothing at all. Fish for compliments in a sea of sharks, dress finely only to let the wolves rip you to shreds, prance in their clothing every Sunday, become a dusted metaphor or two, pretend to be your painter, fancy yourself a rock star, scoff at the ridiculousness of a principled poet. You hear the spoken word slam, yet barely speak at all, disappear into the key of destroy, flat, gaslight, the imagination, gaslight, your mama gaslight, your friends gaslight the city, gaslight the you that plays Heyoka on stage, gaslight the one man without a soul who claims to be your gaslight the city again, gaslight the performance again, pretend to have a name again, 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 and again, and again, 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 hide in the symbol of the nucleus, transcend the spiral, die fiercely only to be born again. In the margins of this third eye, a monarch butterfly exercises the feeling of you to be blossomed out of chaos. Honor the softness that craves to emanate from you. I care enough to observe the spectacle of myself. Charred innocence lingers its eyes into slumber. Camouflage youth, impertinent to maturation, fly north to eucalyptus, forget the previous iteration of a soul's territory, aim to testify upwards at the sky. Build this life as a temporary home, chime exhales, brew a prolonged death, cry for no more here and what was and what is and what migrates, a heartbeat of endless topography. The shape of me conquers into regeneration. There are no values stationary in this grace, just an ounce of face, daring to smile itself into oblivion in order to heal, accept the close proximity to annihilation. Your nearest deathbed is a mirror. It looks a lot like my eyes. Depart from ego, design a framework composed of lotus bloom and let your cynicism dissipate. Magic. Thank you everyone for having me and congratulations to you all.
Mimi, that was incredible.
Oh my God.
So much.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I'm like recovering. That was brilliant. Thank you so much for reading today to close. And thank you again to Ebony, and thank you to Amanda. Thank you to the team at Alma Communications and the team at Monique Meloche for helping prepare for today's event. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making daily conversations like this one possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. For 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics through our monthly publication and public events, all of which are free, like our daily NSE. You can check the chat for a link to donate to support the Rail. And if you're free on Monday at 1 p.m., join us for a conversation with Ishmael Randall Weeks and Tom McGlynn on the event of 20 Años at ICPNA Lima. We'll conclude with a poetry reading by Will Stanier. And as is real tradition, you all can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much for joining us today, and have a good weekend, everyone.
Thank you so much. That was so
Thank
great.
you.
Thank you, Ebony.
Bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Ebony.
Thank you, Chloe.
Beautiful.
Thank you,
Right.
Eleanor.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Amanda, and thank you, Mimi.
Mimi, that
Thank
was,
you.
you were possessed automatism.
Thank you so much, Fong. I appreciate it.